welcome back to Anatomy Phys with Mr. Hamele. Today we're starting our notes on the skin, or the integumentary system. We're going to start out with the general functions and the epidermis in this section of the notes. So, what are the functions of the integumentary system? Mainly protection. Protection against chemical assault, physical assault, and it's a mechanical barrier. It's just really good at keeping things out of your body and keeping the good stuff in. It plays a huge role in body temperature regulation. This is where our body interacts with the outside world. This is where we come in contact with warmer air, colder air, warmer water, colder water. So if we want to regulate body temperature, it's going to involve the skin in some way, shape, or form. One of the ways it does this is by changing the amount of blood flow to our skin. We can dilate our blood vessels, getting them larger, sending more blood to the surface. Okay, if you see that, it's going to make you look redder, right, as blood gets close to the surface. And our skin will act like a radiator. The air blowing over the skin will pick up that heat and carry it away and help to cool you off. But if you're getting too cold, the exact opposite will happen. We'll constrict the blood vessels. We'll make them tighter and smaller so less blood gets to the surface. And in that situation, it keeps the temperature, the heat into the core of your body to keep you warm, and your skin's going to be cold because we don't want that heat blowing away. Okay? And then, of course, we can alter this as well with sweat glands to intensify the cooling. We want it to intensify it. That water's high heat of vaporization will carry more heat away than just wind blowing across the skin on its own. Since this is where our body interacts with the outside world, this is where we have cutaneous sensations. Okay, we have exoreceptors for sensing touch and pain in our skin. Okay, touch, pain, pressure, all those kind of things. Our skin also has some metabolic functions. It produces or synthesizes vitamin D in our dermal blood vessels. And we'll get into a little bit more on that a little bit later in the notes, but that's one of the major functions, often forgotten. Excretion. We do get rid of some nitrogenous wastes, are eliminated from the body in sweat. Nitrogenous waste, same stuff we get rid of in our urine. If you ever looked at a sweat stain on a white shirt or a white baseball cap in the summer, what color is it? Yeah, it's that color yellow because it's got the same stuff in it as your urine. Not as concentrated as in your urine, I'll give you, but it does have the same basic chemical makeup as what you find in urine. So next time you shake somebody's kind of sweaty hand, or you're boxing somebody out on the basketball court and getting their sweat on you, just think about what it is. All right. So our skin consists of three major parts, which is part of how we're going to break down these notes. The most superficial, the part you see when you look at somebody next to you, if you're lucky enough to have somebody sitting next to you right now, is the epidermis. Epi for on top, of the dermis. Okay, so outermost, most superficial region. The dermis is the middle layer. It's the thickest. It's got the most going on as far as metabolic functions and substructures and things like that. And below the dermis, we've got the hypodermis, meaning below the dermis. It's the most superficial fascia, but the deepest part of the skin. So it's kind of where the skin meets the stuff inside your body, okay, that holds it on. All right, you ready to move on? So here we can see we've got the different layers here. So going from the outside in, from superficial, we got the epidermis up on top. That'll be the first layer we study here. You get into the thicker dermis, and you can see it's got all sorts of stuff going on. That's where the blood vessels are, sweat glands, hairs, muscles, oil glands, nerves, nerve endings, all sorts of stuff going on in there. And then the hypodermis is underneath it, and it's mostly adipose tissue and reticular tissue. All right, so let's move on to the epidermis, our first major layer of the skin. It's composed of keratinized, which is a type of protein, hard, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So lots of layers of flat squamous cells. And there are 4 or 5 distinct layers or strata within that, based on how close they are to the blood supply and or how close they are to the surface. Cell types include, but aren't limited to, just the two we're going to focus on, are keratinocytes and melanocytes. And the outer portion of the skin is exposed to the external environment, and its main function is protection. Keep bad stuff out, good stuff in, and not tear open on you. That's why it's got the hard keratinized protein in it. The cells of the epidermis. Let's take a closer look. Keratinocytes. These are cells, sites, that produce keratin, the fibrous protein keratin, which is kind of a waxy protein, a very durable, water-resistant, chemical-resistant protein. Provides a lot of the properties of our epidermis that make it good for resisting water and chemicals and things of that nature. And then we have the melanocytes, which are cells, sites, that produce the brown pigment melanin. And melanin, you may or may not know, is the pigment our skin produces in response to the sun. The more sun exposure you got, the more melanin your cells will try to produce. And melanin basically acts like a little umbrella over your nucleus to help protect your DNA from UV radiation and sunburns. Okay, so that's why we produce more of that. If you're in the sun a lot, you'll produce more melanin, and it'll protect those cells. Our skin also produces vitamin D3 when it's exposed to UV light, so we need UV light exposure for our skin if we're going to produce our own vitamin D3, because we need that for proper bone growth. But that raises an issue, right? We don't want too much UV exposure because it can damage our DNA and cause cancer and skin burns. But if we don't have enough, we can't produce enough vitamin D3, and we're going to have poor bone growth, and like rickets and things. So we have to find that balance. So there's some theories that try to take this into account along with the skin color differentiations we see across the globe. And basically, they're saying it has to do with how close or far from the equator a group of folks is located. So for folks whose ancestors are farther from the equator, like mine would have been, we've got fairly pale skin, not much melanin in it. And the idea is farther from the equator we get, the less sun exposure we have. The days are shorter, particularly in the winter. We tend to have to cover that skin up to stay warm. So we need to maximize our D3 making ability, and we're less worried about cancer evolutionarily. Okay. Between those two things, we have to edge on the side of let more UV through so we can make D3. Whereas the closer you get to the equator, you've got longer days year round. Longer days in the winter for sure, but you got more sun exposure. The sun exposure is more intense and direct, and you're less likely to be covered up as much. So you're going to get a lot more sun exposure. So making vitamin D3 is not really an issue. The issue becomes protecting you from burns and skin cancers, which is why you tend to make more melanin in those areas. So let's take a look at the layers of the epidermis, and we'll start with the bottom layer or the base layer. Okay, so you'll find it mentioned in different textbooks and things using two different words, stratum germinatium and stratum basal. Basal, because kind of the basement membrane, the foundation, everything grows up from this. Stratum germinatium, because it's where everything grows from. What germinates the rest of the cells. It's the stem cell layer for the epidermis. So it is the deepest epidermal layer, and it's firmly attached to your dermis below it. Really tight connection. If you separate the stratum germinatium from the dermis, what you're going to get is blisters. So whenever you have a blister and it kind of puffs up, the fluid in there, everything above the fluid was epidermis, everything below the fluid is dermis. So you've separated either via heat or via friction, and you've separated those two layers, and you get a blister in there. Kind of like when you try to separate a garbage bag. You ever try to do that? Sometimes you got to rub it between your fingers to get it to separate. Well, that's kind of what happens when you get a friction blister, right? You're rubbing that skin so much that it blisters up between the epidermis and the dermis. The stratum germinatium is a single row of the youngest keratinocytes. They're basically stem cells. Well, they are stem cells. Okay, so a single row of those stem cells right at the bottom of the epidermis. And since they're stem cells, they undergo rapid division. And then the older cells are pushed upward. And so we see we're growing from the bottom up. So we add more cells on the bottom and they push the older ones up. Add more cells, push the older ones up. Add more cells, push the older ones up. Add more cells, push the older ones up. Over and over again, and those older cells become the different layers of the epidermis as you work your way up. And they're also able to go rapid cell division because now, if you recall from earlier, these epithelial cells don't have a blood supply. There's no blood or in the epidermis. Okay, that's all down in the dermis. So the ones at the very bottom are the ones that have the closest supply of blood and nutrients and ability to get rid of waste products. So that's where you're going to have the most metabolism going, is in the stratum germinaceum. It's down low, it's close to the blood vessels, so it can get the nutrients it needs and gets rid of its waste products. So it's going to have rapid division and rapid production of cells. In fact, you probably replace nearly your entire epidermis every 30 to 45 days. So here, just to kind of point out the different layers, down here we've got the dermis. Okay, and then this layer right here is the stratum basal. We got some keratinocytes and we have some melanocytes here, all down here in the bottom layer. And they produce new cells and they start to push them up. So these are the next newest cells in what we're going to call the stratum spinosum. And those keep getting pushed up, and the more they get pushed up, you notice how they start to get thinner? Well, that's because they're getting further away from the blood supply down here. Their metabolism starts to slow down. They're making less and less materials, and by the time you get up here, they're dead. They're just layers of dead cells full of the protein keratin, which makes them kind of a sacrificial layer. You can scrape them off and lose them all day long, and it's not going to hurt you at all. Okay, so really, when you're looking at somebody, I mean, if you got your brother, your sister, your parents around or something like that, and you take a look at them, what you're looking at right now here, guys, this is all dead. The outer surface of our bodies is dead. It's kind of like looking at a zombie. You don't have to go very deep to find the living tissue, but the stuff on the surface is dead tissue. All right, so let's move up one layer, or superficial one layer, to the stratum spinosum, or spiny layer. It's called that because they kind of have this web-like system of intermediate filaments attached to desmosomes. So if you got a lot of intermediate filaments and they're attached to desmosomes, what are these cells good at resisting? Right, they're good at resisting pulling forces. This keeps them from getting ripped apart, pulled off when they scrape against things. They're held together really tight because they're making all these intermediate filaments and desmosomes to connect the different cells. That's why they're called spiny. Moving up another layer, we get to the stratum granulosum, or the granular layer. And this is where we really start to see more drastic changes in the appearance of these keratinocytes. Okay, they start to become flattened and more keratinized. They're basically just, all they're doing now is, for whatever they can do, they're making keratin, and that's about it. Trying to fill that cell up with that protein. So they're getting flat, losing cytoplasm, starting to look a lot more squamous. And that keratin I mentioned before is a very durable protein, and it's a water-resistant protein. It provides a lot of that protective resistance that we find in the epidermis. And the reason this is happening is getting further and further away from the blood supply. It's harder for water and nutrients to diffuse and osmose up to them, and for waste products to get out. So metabolism just gets slower and slower and slower. Okay. So next, the layers of the epidermis, we'll look at the stratum lucidum, or the clear layer. Now, this one is that, remember I said 4 or 5 layers? This is that or 5. The stratum lucidum, which means clear, like lucid thought, is found only in the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet, where you need some extra tough skin, because this is where your body's really getting some real rough use. Okay? So it's thin, transparent, above the stratum granulosum, just got a few rows of dead keratinocytes, and it makes up this extra layer that we see in these areas that take a lot of wear and tear and need tougher skin. All right, and now on to the top layer, the stratum corneum, or the horny layer. It's not called the horny layer because what you look at and say, ooh, that person's beautiful. It is called the horny layer because the cells in it are the cells that make up, and the material in it, the keratin, that make up things like your fingernails, your hair, and horns on things like rhinoceroses and cattle and things. So it's called the horny layer, same material. It's the outermost layer of keratinized cells, and accounts for most of the thickness of the epidermis. Usually between 15 to 30 layers, depending where you're at and how much abrasion that area is getting. If it's not getting much abrasion, you're going to be able to build up more layers without them getting torn off. If it's in a high abrasive area, you might lose a little bit more. Lots of desmosomes connect some of the layers, so they're nice, tough layers. Help not only the cells themselves tough, but they're held together toughly. Is that a word? I don't know. So waterproofing, protection from abrasion and penetration, and it renders the body relatively insensitive to biological, chemical, and physical assault. Obviously, not impervious, but it's a pretty tough membrane. Okay? Most bacteria and viruses can't get through it. You need a cut for those to even think about getting through your skin. So intact skin is a really good barrier against infection. And really, that's why with all this coronavirus stuff, we're wearing masks and goggles, because these are the areas where it can get in and get past that epidermis. So here's a little saying how to remember the layers from the bottom up. Here, Germinophium, Spinosum, Granulosum, Lucidum in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, and Corneum. So here we go from the top down. Cornelius's lucky grandma speaks German. German for Germinophium, stratum basal. The bottom layer where you're making everything. Cornelius for Corneum. The top layer, the horny layer, the protective layer with all the sacrificial dead cells on it. And that does it for our first part of the skin, taking a look at the epidermis. Join me in the next set of notes when we cover part 2, and we'll take a look at skin coloration and diagnosis of different disorders based on skin coloration and some of the more common skin cancers. Have a good day, folks, and I will see you soon. Bye.